When we talk about tithing today in the Christian church, there's a lot of verses that people use from the Bible to support this practice. The problem is, many of the verses that we use to justify tithing as we do it today are completely misused, misunderstood, and twisted. So in this series, we're taking common verses that are used to argue for a modern day tithe for Christians, and we're taking a look at what do they really say. We are untwisting these often misunderstood scriptures, not so that we don't have to give, but so that we can encourage Christians to be generous and to give cheerfully instead of feeling like we have to give under a compulsory tithe. So for part 4 of this series, we're going to look today at Deuteronomy chapter 14, verses 22 through 26. And this is a verse that a lot of people used to say the tithe has always been about money. And it's okay to use the tithe as a monetary tithe, as opposed to what Scripture teaches, which is that tithing in the law, the Mosaic Levitical law, was always food, and it was always for the Levites and the poor, not for the church or buildings or programs or just for the temple. Now, if you want to catch up on any of that, this all started with a 2-episode podcast conversation that you can check out here, where we broke down every single verse in the Bible and what it says about tithing, as well as what it doesn't say about tithing. And if you want to catch up on the other 3 parts of this series, some of the most commonly misunderstood scriptures about tithing, you can check that out here in this playlist. You can check out, we talked about verses like Malachi chapter 3, where we've looked at what Jesus said about tithing. But today's video, again, it's about Deuteronomy 14. Now, what is the argument? We always start these videos out with what is the common argument for these specific passages? Well, the common argument here for Deuteronomy 14, 22 through 26 is that it's okay for the tithe to be money. Because again, as we taught in the original podcast, the Bible never mentions a monetary tithe. Tithing throughout the Old Testament was always food, agriculture, animals, and it was given to the Levites, given to poor people, given so that they could eat. So this is a common argument we get where people say, no, Jeff, you're wrong. You guys at Church Disrupted, you just don't get it, because Deuteronomy 14:22, it actually says that the tithe could be money. But is that what this passage actually says? As we always do when we jump into one of these passages, let's ask a couple of hermeneutical questions. First, questions to help us make sure that we're approaching this in the right way theologically. The first question, who is writing this passage? Now, because we're talking about Deuteronomy and an Old Testament passage like this, it is mostly believed that this was Moses, okay? That this was Moses writing Deuteronomy. What was the writer writing about? Well, he was writing to Israel about the law, and in this passage, specifically tithing in the Mosaic law. Remember, tithing in the Mosaic law already, that was for Israel, and it was to provide for the Levites and the poor. He's not talking to Gentiles in the church age. He's not talking to anyone outside of Israel, and he's not talking about tithes that would provide for anyone other than the Levites and the poor. But again, where people get hung up on this passage is they say this passage proves that it's okay for us to take the current monetary tithe today, where we teach people things like, if you don't give 10% of your income to the church, that you're being disobedient. And the problem with that is simply that the Bible doesn't teach it. Yet verses like this, misused, are things that people have used to actually teach the contrary and keep people stuck in this burden of compulsory giving, that I have to give to the church this specific amount or God is mad at me. And what that does, it steals from us the ability to be generous. So let's look at what Deuteronomy 14:22 through really 29 actually says. Okay, so first of all, this is going to be talking about 3 separate tithes in this small passage, because you got to go back and read what's already been taught about tithing in the law. Most people never realize there are 3 separate tithes in the law. And again, if you go back and check out that original podcast, you're going to see that there were 3 separate tithes in the Old Testament law, okay? This passage is going to talk about all 3 of these tithes. The emphasis is actually going to be on 2 tithes that we rarely talk about, though. The emphasis is going to be on the 2 tithes that are most different from the tithes we talk about today. But again, this passage can be used to argue a monetary tithe by people who don't understand that there were 3 tithes, or by people who are just banking on the fact that you don't know that there were 3 tithes. So let's start in verse 22. We're going to look at this together. Verse 22, Deuteronomy 14 says this: "Be sure to set aside 1/10 of all that your fields produce each year." Okay? So this is talking about be sure to set aside 1/10 of all that you produce each year. This is talking about really all 3 tithes. It's the Levitical tithe, which is what I think it's talking about most, but it's also talking about the tithe with feast and the poor tithe. Every year, you're going to set aside at least 10%. That's going to go to make sure that the tribe of Levi, including the priests and temple workers, are taken care of. But he quickly moves on to talk about a very specific tithe. This is the second tithe right here in verse 23. He says, "Eat the tithe of your grain, new wine, and olive oil, all agricultural, and the firstborn of your herds and flocks in the presence of the Lord your God, at the place he will choose as a dwelling for his name, so that you may learn to revere the Lord your God always." So in verse 23, we learn a couple of important things that may blow your mind about tithing if you've never studied the subject. First of all, he starts in verse 23 by saying, you are to eat the tithe, okay? And he says, this is grain, this is olive oil, this is cattle, this is all agricultural, but he starts by saying, you're supposed to eat this tithe. This specific tithe, the second tithe, is for your enjoyment. It is for a celebratory feast, and part of that is to honor God. Part of that is to enjoy it. Have you ever heard a pastor in modern times tell you that sometimes you can give a tithe that you actually keep? That you can give a tithe to honor the Lord that you end up keeping for a feast or celebration with other people? Okay, we don't teach that kind of thing. But this was a very specific meal, okay? And that's what we're going to learn in verse 24. But this was a specific meal that they were to eat with the town Levite, and there was a designated place for this meal. Everybody had a different kind of holy designated place they had to go, and that's going to play an important role here in just a minute. But let's start with this. This tithe that Deuteronomy is talking about right now, it was not a donation. It was not a donation. It was for a celebratory meal that the tithe giver would also be a part of. So let's go to verses 24, 25. We'll read them together and then we'll break them down. Okay? So remember, they got to go to a designated place, and here's what it says. But if that place designated for the meal is too distant, and you have been blessed by the Lord and cannot carry your tithe, because the place where the Lord will choose to put his name is so far away, then you can exchange your tithe for silver and take the silver with you and go to the place the Lord your God will choose. Okay? So here's what it is saying. There's a couple of things going on. One, if the place is too far away for you to comfortably take your tithe, your herds, okay, the animals that you're actually going to slaughter for this meal, the food you're going to slaughter for this meal. If the place is too far away, you can exchange your tithe for silver. Basically, sell it, take the silver, and shekels of silver was what they were using for money at this time. So basically, you can sell it for money, and then you can go to the place. But he also says, if you've just been really blessed, then 10%, this 10% that you're taking, by the way, that you were going to eat in a celebratory meal, this 10% that you're taking might be too much as well, okay? So what this is a concession. It is a concession that was made so that you could convert your tithe into money for the sake of making the travel easier. Because even this tithe, it wasn't supposed to be a burden. It was supposed to be something that was a way to take care of the Levites and to take care of the poor. So this was a concession to make it easier for them to travel in these scenarios. But let's go ahead and look at verse 26. This is where it gets, I think, really interesting. Use the silver to buy whatever you like: cattle, sheep, wine, fermented drink, or anything you wish. That's going to be really important. Anything that you wish. Then you and your household shall eat there in the presence of the Lord your God and rejoice. So what does it say? It says in this, yes, you can convert your tithe to silver and to money if the trip is too long. But as soon as you get to the place where you're supposed to eat this meal, convert it back. Use that money to buy the food that you would have brought, or to buy even better food. Buy the stuff you want. Buy the good fermented drink. Buy the choice meats. Buy what you want for this feast. But this is one of the only concessions we see where tithes could be turned into money, but also notice they had to be converted back. They weren't supposed to stay money. They were supposed to be converted back to food. And it was food for enjoyment in this feast, because they were supposed to eat the tithe as a celebration before the Lord. So let's go to verse 27 and see what pops up next. And do not neglect the Levites living in your towns, for they have no allotment or inheritance of their own. Now, this is very important because the Levites were at the center of all of these tithes. Out of the 12 tribes of Israel, there was one that did not have their own allotment of land. And you can go back and read in the Old Testament. There's specific reasons for that, okay? But they didn't have their own allotment of land. And from the tribe of Levi is where you would get your priest and temple workers. So not all Levites actually worked in the temple. Not all Levites were priests. You're actually going to see that even Levites that were priests sometimes were in the town. It talks about town Levites, but this tribe didn't have their own land and they were serving the people of God. So the tithe was first and foremost to take care of them. And second, portions of the tithe, not all of them, but portions of the tithe were also to take care of the poor. So in verse 27, this is just a reminder. Hey, a reminder. This meal with the Levite is a reminder to you of what the tithes are for. When you're giving this 10%, you're not just blindly giving to programs. You're not blindly giving to buildings. You're not giving just because you have to. You're giving because your giving of your food, just a portion of your food, means that the Levites who serve you stay alive, that they're taken care of because they don't have an inheritance and you are providing their inheritance, right? That changes the way we feel when we give our tithe, when we know it's going to provide for someone that we care about. But this verse is also a transition. It's a reminder that the tithe that just talked about is for the Levites. It's also a reminder that the third tithe that it's about to talk about, the third different tithe in this passage, that is also for the Levites. Because again, tithing was always food, and it was always for the Levites or for the poor. So I want to go ahead and read verses 28 and verses 29. And I'll go ahead and tell you, most people don't read 27, 28, and 29 because they're just trying to make the point that the tithe could be money. But when we read all this, we see all three tithes in one place, and I think it's super life-giving. But right after that, okay, don't neglect the Levites living in your town, for they have no allotment or inheritance of their own. The writer of Deuteronomy moves to the next tithe, this third tithe, at the end of every 3 years. That's important because this tithe only happened every 3 years. It wasn't an every year, every kind of crop tithe. At the end of every 3 years, bring all the tithes of that year's produce and store it in your towns. So every 3 years, you were doing something different with the tithe. You were going to bring your tithe at the end of every 3 years, and everybody was going to bring it to the center of the town square. And in the center of the town square, here's what was going to happen. Store it in your town so that the Levites, who have no allotment or inheritance of their own, and the foreigners, the fatherless, and the widows who live in your towns may come and eat and be satisfied, and so that the Lord will bless all the work of your hands. Because the Lord had told them, as long as you were tithing, you're going to have enough crops. As long as you're taking care of the people, you're going to have enough crops. But every 3 years, there was this whole separate tithe where they brought out 10%, and they brought it for not just the Levites, but all of the poor. because there were people who were way too poor to tithe, and it was taking the tithe that was God honoring. It was taking the tithe that would keep these widows and orphans alive, right? This was really, it's what we would call a reverse tithe today. Okay, it was a reverse tithe where people brought all this stuff directly, and then the people who needed it just took what they needed. But think about what it wasn't. None of these tithes were for buildings. None of these tithes were for starting ministry programs. As a matter of fact, when the temple was built, it was fundraised through offerings and taxes and other things. It was never built off of the tithe, right? So what can we learn from this today? I think it's very clear that this passage is not saying, it's not teaching a monetary tithe. It's not teaching that we should give 10% of our income. It's teaching that if the meal for the Israelites with the Levite was too far away, they could convert their tithe to money and then convert it back. It's also, hopefully, if you've never heard this before, hopefully this is blowing your mind a little bit, that one of the tithes was a meal that you ate. You didn't give that tithe away as much as you shared it with someone else in celebration. But as always, there are things that we can learn even from Old Testament passages that weren't written directly to us. So there's a few things I think we can learn here. First, this passage, it's not about a money tithe, and it doesn't teach a monetary tithe anything like what we teach today, okay? So when you hear teaching about tithing today, just know it's gotten very far off, for the most part, of what the Bible teaches about tithing. And if somebody uses this verse to say, hey, no, the Bible does teach monetary tithing and giving of your money from the beginning, no, it doesn't. You can go back, you can look, you can see this. The Bible does teach generosity through offerings with your money, but not through tithe. But second, and I think this is really the bigger lesson here, this passage teaches us that generosity should always be first and foremost about caring for people. Generosity should first and foremost always be about caring for people. What were the tithes for? The Levitical tithe was for the Levites and the temple workers. All right, the second tithe was for you to share a meal with the Levite to be reminded what your tithes were for. And the third tithe was for the Levites and for all of the poor, including widows, orphans, foreigners, immigrants, all of that sort of thing. The point of the tithes was to care for people in need. And that's what our giving today, our generosity in churches should be about. First and foremost, before any buildings, any programs, and guys, I'm not anti-programs, I'm not anti-buildings, but before we take care of those things, we should be taking care of the needs in our communities, okay? We must care for the people in our communities with needs before we build bigger buildings and flashier programs. I just think we have to if we want to honor God. Okay? And the people of Israel, think about this. They always knew where their tithes went. We see it throughout this passage. Every single tithe that they gave, they knew where it went. They usually knew where their offerings were going as well. And we can learn this in the same way. We should know where our modern offerings and generosity that we give to churches is going. So if you go to a church that is very transparent and tells you this is where the money's going, this is how we're spending your tithes, this specific offering, it's where it's going, and they show receipts so that you can make sure it was spent in those areas, then bravo, that's an incredible church. Please thank your pastor for me, because that is absolutely phenomenal. But if you go to a church that is always asking for money but isn't transparent about where that money is going, you don't know where that tithe is going, you don't know where those offerings are going, then it's okay to ask questions, and it's also to give to other places if you need that are transparent about where it's going, because the Israelites always knew where their money was going. So anytime a church is not being forthright and they're not being transparent and detailed about where their money is going, that's usually not a good sign. And even if they don't publish that level of detail, many pastors, if you ask them, will answer any of the questions that you have. If they don't, that's a huge red flag. But again, a lot of pastors are going to do that. So Deuteronomy 14, it doesn't teach a money tithe. It doesn't teach anything about giving money. It teaches about caring for people, specifically caring for the Levites, for the poor. And my favorite part of this, Deuteronomy 14 teaches about a tithe that you use to celebrate. You don't give it away, you use it to celebrate. It was a tithe that you eat. So this passage, I love it because it broke my brain the first time that I read it and understood it, but it opened my heart to giving and generosity in incredible ways and in new ways. I hope it did the same for you. I'll see you in the next part of the series as we talk about Abraham's tithe to Melchizedek. And this is one of the absolute most misunderstood, misused passages in the Old Testament, and it's used to actually teach that the tithe comes before the law. That's not quite what it teaches. This tithe was very different than what we think, but I'll save that for the next episode. I hope to see you there. Until then, be blessed, be generous. Let's try to meet the needs of people around us, but let's do it as cheerful givers, not under compulsion, not because somebody told us we have to, but because we're grateful and we want to honor the Lord who's blessed us.